Forspoken is the new action-adventure RPG game from Square Enix, and it's an absolute beast to try and run on PC. Hi guys, I'm Colesy, and today I'm going to be suggesting and recommending some PCs that I have found that meet the ridiculously high level that Forspoken is asking from a PC. It wants some serious performance. I have sorted through a bunch of PCs on Amazon, both in the UK and the US, so there's a recommendation there for everyone. If you know the joke about can it run Crysis? Crysis used to be a game that was notoriously difficult to run on PC, so the joke became can it run Crysis? I feel like Forspoken might just have pipped them at the post there with the spec that they want you to have. There are different levels to the required spec. So there is a minimum level, a recommended level, and an ultra level. And we'll be going through all of those. I have PCs for every single one of those levels that will meet those requirements if you want to play Forspoken. I have these requirements from an article from Dextero, but they are also listed on the Steam page here. At least the minimum and the recommended are listed on Steam. The Ultra is not, but I have it in a screenshot, so I can show you guys, and we can recommend some PCs. Without further ado, let's jump into looking at some of the PCs, shall we? The minimum spec that Forspoken is asking for on PC is, I'm going to read it off here, it wants an AMD Ryzen 5 1600, or an Intel Core i7-3770. Video card wise, it wants a Radeon RX 5500 XT 8GB card, or an Nvidia GeForce GTX 1060 6GB card. 16GB of RAM. Now, here's the thing with the minimum spec. The resolution that it is saying that we are aiming for here is 720p at 30 frames per second. Now, that's quite low for nowadays, I think. I think most people are aiming for 1080 60. So I think minimum here is really, really a low minimum if you're aiming for 720, 30 frames per second. But that's what the requirements are saying, and so I have PCs which meet or exceed slightly those specs. We're going to start off with the UK PCs. We'll do UK PCs, then US PCs. They are different because obviously if you live in the US, you can't get some of the UK suppliers, and if you live in the UK, you can't get some of the US PCs. So I have done two separate lists of PCs. First one here, we are starting with the AdMe gaming PC. So this has our Ryzen 5500, an RTX 2060 6GB graphics card, 16GB of DDR4 RAM, a 500GB SSD, 550 watt PSU, and a case, Windows 11. So it meets all of those. Also, I didn't mention, but the hard drive it's asking for is asking for 150GB of hard drive space. So we have an SSD here with 500GB, plenty of room. So this definitely beats the spec it's asking for, like I said, because these are new parts rather than the older parts that they're asking for on the minimum. This is $729.95. It's by no means what I would call cheap. It's a good value PC. You're not going to be able to play this game apparently for like £300 PC unless you buy something secondhand, possibly if you get lucky. These are going to be the cheapest PCs we start with. As we go up the recommendations to recommended and ultra, these PCs are going to start to get a little more expensive. All the links for these PCs will be down in the description, by the way, if you want to check them out. Next up, we have a Vibox 223. I'm going to say that's 223. I don't know how to pronounce that. Gaming PC, 6-core Intel i5 10400F processor, a GTX 1660, 6GB card, 16GB of RAM, terabyte hard drive, 240GB SSD, Windows 11. So again, this is better than the spec, the minimum spec that is being asked for from Forspoken. Graphics card wise is 1660, so more powerful than 1060 because it's a generation newer. 6-core Intel i5, so again, we're beating the i7 3770 that it's asking for. 16GB of RAM, which is exactly what it's asking for. And we've got a hard drive and an SSD here. So this one has options. You could, if you have a bit more money maybe, and you like this look of this PC, but you'd rather have the RTX 3050, for example, you can play around with the options. Obviously, the price is going to be different. And the same with the case. So I've gone for the absolute cheapest case here, just to keep the price as low as possible. So this might be an option for you. Maybe you just like, I like it, but I'd rather have, this white case, for example. That's up to you, but it's going to cost you what? An extra £30, up to you. That's your decision at that point. We're over to the United States now with our PC recommendation. So what I've tried to do one AMD PC recommendation and one Intel-based PC recommendation for both UK and US. There will be some that are different and I have more or less of, but we'll get to that as we go. So this is a pretty similarly spec'd PC to the 2060 one that we saw in the UK. It's got a Ryzen 5 3600, 6-core CPU, RTX 2060, terabyte SSD, 16 gig of DDR4 RAM, all that. So this is a 2060 powered machine. 2060 is the graphics card. It is $999.99. So nearest damn it, $1,000. I felt that was a little bit expensive for basically the same spec, but that's going to happen. Prices are going to differ from the UK to the US, so sometimes it will be cheaper in the US than it is in the UK and the other way around. But we do have some other options for the minimum spec. So this one, if we drop down from having the 2060 into having, instead of the 2060, we got a 1660 Super, again, still meets the minimum spec. Still got a Ryzen 5 3600, 16 gig of RAM. It's got a 500 gig SSD. And Windows 10, which, again, it's saying Windows 10 is perfectly good enough, but, I mean, it's easily upgradable to Windows 11, and this PC will be able to run Windows 11 no problem. This is $899.99 today. It is 31% off. It's normally apparently $1,300. It's a good deal, and at the time of me recording this, that is the price. If it changes, I can't help that, so if you want to grab it for this price, then I would jump on it pretty quick before it changes. Okay, next up we have another option. This is the Intel option for the US PCs. This is a Skytech Blaze 2 gaming PC, i5 10400F, GTX 1660 Super, 500 gig SSD, 16 gig of DDR4 RAM, Windows 10, 600 watt power supply. Some of them do say the power supply, some of them don't. I've tried to pick PCs that seem to have a decent rating. The company has a good rating on Amazon. This is a renewed premium apparently, so again, this is cheaper, but it is the only one in stock, so it's quite possible this might go quick, but there are the other two PCs which you have the option of. Again, these are your choices. These are something for you to look at. I don't personally have a preference between Intel or AMD in terms of CPU, but being as the specs give us those different CPU recommendations, I've gone with those. I haven't generally gone with the AMD graphics card on these PCs just purely because I don't know them quite as well, but I believe there's one or two which I did go with the recommended AMD video card. I've generally stuck to the Nvidia. It's what I know. It's my preference, but again, decision's up to you really with whatever PC you buy. Right, so they are all the PCs that we have gone through for the minimum spec. There's a bunch there, so if you're interested in one of those, go check out the links in the description. Now, just because these PCs only just make it into the minimum spec to run Forspoken does not mean by any means that they are bad PCs. They are good PCs and they will run a lot of games. It's just Forspoken seems to have crazy like required specs to get like what I would deem normal playable frame rate and display. I would say if you're aiming for 1080p 60, that should be your aim generally when gaming, and I'm sure these PCs will play a lot of games at that resolution, at that frame rate. So just because it's minimum on Forspoken does not mean it's a like really cheap basic PC. These are really nice, good, decent, solid PCs. If you're looking to play anything other than Forspoken and you want to spend as little as possible, then these PCs will be a solid bet. Depending on what you want to play, obviously, it depends game to game, and that's why I do these lists where I pick a specific game and choose out PCs for that game. But if you do have any questions, if there is any game that you want me to say, would this PC work for, then let me know in the comments, message me on Twitter, do any of that cool stuff. Moving on from the minimum spec to the recommended spec that Forspoken is asking for. So, the recommended spec is asking for Windows 10 64-bit or Windows 11 64-bit, AMD Ryzen 5 3600 or an Intel Core i7 8700K, an AMD Radeon RX 6700 XT 12GB card, or an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3070 8GB. Memory, RAM, it wants 24GB. The display resolution that we're aiming at here is 1440p 30fps, which again I think is weird because I don't like the idea of aiming for 30 FPS. I'd rather have 60. I'd rather play 1080p 60 and 1440p 30. Personally, I think that's better. And I'm assuming these PCs would be able to do 1080 60 because it's saying it'll do 1440 30. So I'm assuming they'll be able to do 1080 60 if you're aiming for 1080p. In terms of hard drive / SSD, now it's saying that you want an SSD with 150 gig of space. So stepping up quite a lot here from 720 30 FPS to 1440 30 FPS, in my opinion. I feel like 1080 60 would have been a decent, nice step up, but this seems to have jumped up a little bit, and so the PCs jump up a little bit. Again, starting off in the UK, so we have this PC from Ginger6. Bit of a strange name. I know it's a bit of a strange name company, but I have at least heard of them. Even though these PCs don't actually have any reviews, the Ginger6 ones, they were kind of the only ones that sort of met this spec. A lot of the problem here was the memory that it's asking for, because it's asking for 24 gig, which is not a standard amount of memory that generally you buy. You normally get 8, and then it doubles to 16, and then it doubles again to 32, and then you double it again to 64. That's generally how memory is sold in PCs. Nobody really does 24. So you could upgrade, a 16 gig PC and add some more RAM to it, but just to be on the safe side, I have selected PCs that only have 32 gig of RAM, just purely because that definitely meets the spec. Ginger6 G6 gaming PC. It's got a Ryzen 5 4500. It's got an 8 gig RTX 3070, 512 gig M.2 SSD, a 2TB hard drive, and 32 gig of DDR4 RAM. Again, meets all the spec that we have listed there. Out specs on the CPU. It also outspecs on the hard drive space needed, I guess, and it outspecs on the RAM. So it is a little bit above the recommended, but a lot of these PCs are going to be just purely because nobody sells a PC with 24 gig of RAM. So this PC is £1,251.34. Strange amount of money, I agree. I don't know why it's that price. That is the price, but yes, I have heard of the company. So next up, we have Intel's take on this. CyberPower PC, Lux Gaming PC. Intel Core i7 11700F, RTX 3078 gig, 32 gig of RAM, a terabyte NVMe SSD, 650 watt power supply, blah, 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 nice looking case, looks cool. Again, there's more options here on this PC if you'd like to slightly customize it a bit. If you want to change the GPU or the CPU, you can actually do this on this particular one. But again, I've gone for the one that is the lowest price that meets the recommended spec that we're looking at. So this one is £1,484.40. So a little bit more than the last one, but it does have a lot of ratings. So I think you can, if you weren't feeling so comfortable with the first one not having as many ratings from the Ginger6 one, which I still think is a strange name, but as a Ginger, I respect it. Onward to the next PC. Oh, it appears we have another UK PC. I was forgetting that we had another one. I thought we were on to America. It's an Intel i9 11900F, RTX 3070, 32 gig of RAM, terabyte M.2, Windows 11. Okay, so this is £1,424.95. Again, very, very similar spec to the last one. This has an i9 in it, so it is a little bit more, and it's basically the same price. I think that's why I decided to put this one in as well. It's an i9 rather than the i7, so it's a little bit of an upgrade, and the price is pretty much the same. So maybe this is an option for you. Again, I've picked just the cheapest case. You can select a lot of other different cases. You can also select different GPUs, but I've gone for, again, the cheapest one that meets the spec that we're looking at for Forspoken. First US PC that meets the recommended spec is this M-powered PC Sentinel Gamer Desktop. It's got an RTX 3070, AMD Ryzen 7 5700X, 32 gig of RAM, 512 gig SSD, plus a 2TB hard drive, 650 watt power supply, Windows 11 Pro. The only thing with this one, it's not the most cool looking PC. I'm going to be honest, it's a bit of a stealth build, but maybe that's what you're into. And to be honest, at the end of the day, I'd rather go with spec than looks than anything. So yeah, this seems like a really good PC that meets the spec. It's $1,399.99, so $1,400. Reviews for this company seem pretty good. I hadn't actually heard of them. I haven't heard of the US brands as much as I've heard of the UK brands, just purely because I'm in the UK. So I have to go a lot more off the ratings for the US PCs. But this does meet the spec, and it seemed to be fairly decently priced compared to some others. Here we have another US PC. Now this one is a little different because it's one of the ones that has the Radeon graphics card rather than the Nvidia one. But I felt for the price, it still met the spec and it made sense to include it. It's a Cyberpower Gamer Supreme gaming desktop. It's got a Ryzen 7 3700X, 32 gig of memory. It's got the Radeon RX 6700 XT, terabyte SSD, 2 terabyte hard drive, Windows 10, blah, 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 blah. It's got all the spec that we need. It is $1,349.99. It's got the SSD space. It has the exact video card that they are recommending. It has more memory than is necessary because it has 32 over the 24. And again, it is slightly above the Ryzen 5 that they're asking for in the recommended spec. So this definitely meets the spec. It is cheaper than the last one. In my opinion, I like it. I like the look-wise better, but that's a personal choice and it's all up to you. This is the final PC we have. This is the Intel CPU version recommendation, I guess. It's an Asus. Now, I've heard of Asus. They're a worldwide well-known brand, so I figured this is worth featuring, being as it only has one rating, but Asus are a well-known brand. So this is the ProArt Station PD5 desktop. 11th gen i7. It's got an 11700, RTX 3070, Windows 11, 32 gig of RAM, 2 terabyte PCIe SSD. Now, I believe from just the look of this and the name of it, the fact it's called a ProArt, this is more for like a design person, if you're doing artwork, 3D design, stuff like that. But the specs meet the recommended spec of Forspoken, so it'll be able to play it. It's just a bit of a strange looking PC because it's not got loads of RGB and stuff in it like you expect a gamer PC to have. But again, it's not marketed as a gaming PC, but it does have the spec that it would be able to play Forspoken at the recommended spec. That's a lot of PCs for the recommended spec. You might be thinking, the recommended spec was already 1440p, so the ultra spec for Forspoken is really where it takes next level jumps. So we're going to be looking at 4K and what kind of spec PC you'll need to run Forspoken in 4K. The ultra category, which isn't on Steam but is on this article that I'm reading, lists this as the spec for the ultra category for Forspoken. It wants an AMD Ryzen 5 5800X or an Intel Core i7 12700. Graphics card, it wants an AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT 16 gig or an Nvidia GeForce RTX 4080 16 gig. Memory-wise, 32 gig, which is fine because a lot of the PCs we just did were 32 gig, so these are also going to be 32 gig. Display resolution, we're looking at 2160p, which I believe, if I'm correct, is 4K, at 60 FPS. And this time the hard drive and SSD not only specifies an SSD with 150 gig, it wants it to be an NVMe SSD with 150 gig. At a guess, I don't think it would matter too much if it was on a normal SSD rather than an NVMe SSD. NVMe are a lot faster, so it might make a difference, but I personally wouldn't have thought so. But I have met the spec with the PCs I'm about to recommend just to be safe. First UK PC we have here is an Audit gaming PC. AMD Ryzen 9 5900X, RTX 4080, 32 gig of RAM, Asus B550 motherboard, terabyte Gen 4 NVMe, Windows 11. Looks like a solid looking PC. Now, the prices that we're starting to look for PCs now, these things better be absolutely beautiful, and this looks like an absolutely beautiful PC. It is £2,519.95. This is not a cheap thing to buy, but it is high quality. It has some of the best components that you can buy, the top of the line, high-end components with the Ryzen 9, the RTX 4080. But apparently Forspoken expects that of you if you want to run this game in Ultra. Next one, we have the Vibox or VBox? Don't know. And is it 7 or is it V11? I don't know. Intel i7 12700F, RTX 4080, 32 gig of RAM, 480 gig SSD, and a 2 terabyte hard drive. I would hope for the £2,404 that this costs, that's an NVMe SSD. Whether it's Gen 4 or not, fine. That doesn't make too big of a difference. But I would hope that you're not just putting a 2.5-inch drive. It's got a 2TB hard drive as well. But, I mean, you're not going to run the game on that because it's asking you to put it on an SSD. But, again, you're looking at the £2,500 mark for these PCs. It's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But if you're looking for top end to run Forspoken on PC, then these are some good recommendations for you. Now, next up, we have the US recommendation. Now, when I say US recommendation, I only have the one because there wasn't anything else that met the spec at anywhere near this price. And I wouldn't normally recommend something like this because I'm not sure about the upgradability in future. But as it is, it's a PC and it's going to work, right? It's a well-known brand. It is the Alienware Aurora R10 liquid-cooled gaming desktop. They're well-known. They work. I don't know how upgradable it is. It looks cool, but that doesn't always mean that the case is going to be upgradable. But I assume you should be able to remove the parts and put them in a different case if you so wanted to in future. You wouldn't need to upgrade this thing for a while anyway, because it is solid. So this PC has an AMD Ryzen 9 5900, 32GB of RAM, 2TB SSD, 2TB hard drive. It has got the Radeon RX 6800 XT 16GB card. So again, we've gone for the AMD side of the graphics card rather than Nvidia. Again, it was really hard to find a PC that met this spec on Amazon US for some reason. But this PC actually, comparatively, is a great price for that. It's $2,000. It's a lot of money, but compared to like the UK, this is significantly cheaper. If something like this was available in the UK, which I didn't see it on the UK Amazon, I would recommend this. This seems like a solid, cheapest way to get the ultra spec for Forspoken on PC. So there we go. Those are all my PC recommendations. Now, I know the price range it goes from like $750 to like $2,500. It's a big gap. And that's because it really depends what resolution you're playing at. If you have a 1080p monitor, I think you're going to want to aim somewhere in the middle. Like I said, I think it's weird that the recommended spec is aiming for 1440p 30 frames per second rather than saying 1080 60. I guess that's preference, but I would always aim for a higher frame rate than a higher resolution personally. I think the smoothness of a higher frame rate is nicer. So these are my recommendations. Now, here's the thing. I love PC gaming. I really enjoy PC gaming. It's my preferred gaming category, genre, system, whatever I call it. But if you don't want to spend even the £750 to get the cheapest one that meets the minimum spec, and again, like I said, those PCs aren't bad by any means. They are good PCs. It's just Forspoken is a very, very difficult game to run, it appears. Even though it's going to run only at 720 30 FPS, apparently, according to these spec sheets. A lot of other games will run 1080 60 nicely, and older games, if you want to play CSGO, that's going to run much higher than 60 at 1080p. You'll have a great experience with those PCs if you want to buy even the lower end ones that I've recommended. But if you really want to get the best visual experience from Forspoken for the cheapest possible price, you might as well buy a PS5, to be honest. Now, I'm not a PC master race enthusiast. I'm not like against consoles. Consoles fine if that's what you're into and that's better for you. And I completely understand it in cases like this where you're going, hang on, I have to spend £750 minimum to get 720p 30 FPS, whereas I can buy a PS5 for what, $500, $550? You can buy the game for what, an extra $60, $70, pounds, £50, £60, I don't know. If you said all in on a PS5 and the game Forspoken for $700, that's a big, I reckon you're saving a lot of change from that $700. £50 cheaper. Then that makes sense. I get it. That might, that's going to play better, I would imagine, than the lowest PC would. If I got a PS5 and I was playing Forspoken and it ran at 720p 30 frames per second, I'd be annoyed. So I'm going to assume it's going to run better. I don't know graphically how the graphics will compare to PC, you know, from PC to PS5. I would hope they would be somewhere near. This is what I'm saying. If you're looking at this and going, that's too expensive, those PCs are still too expensive for me. It's cheaper for me to buy a PS5. Go for it. I totally understand it. But for those of you that are looking for PCs, I hope my recommendations have been helpful. Again, it's just me scouring through lists of PCs, trying to pick out the ones that are decent, the ones that are good, the ones that are good value, the ones that meet the spec, and avoid all the ones that are trying to get you to buy it when the spec is probably like used product, older spec. I'm just trying to help out here if I can. And I know that a lot of people will be excited for Forspoken, so I figured, and especially being as the insane spec that it requires from some PCs to run this game, it felt like an interesting video for me to make and to see how much these PCs to run that spec would cost you. So I hope you guys have found this interesting, found this useful. All the links to everything I've mentioned in the video will be in the description if you want to check it out. Like I said, these aren't the only PCs on Amazon that run this, but they are the ones I have picked, like personally picked out to recommend. So if you find something different that meets the spec and is cheaper, congratulations, good job you. That's awesome, and I'm glad that you saved yourself some money. And if you decide to buy one of these PCs, I hope that I have helped you, and I hope you're happy with the PC you end up with. But thank you guys for watching, and I will see you again next time. Bye!